you friends and brethren around the world. Contrary to what you may hear from your minister or from the ministry of the scattered churches of God, there is no Philadelphia work today. That work ended on January the 16th, 1986, when the apostle of that era died. Mr. Armstrong was the messenger to Philadelphia, and Jesus Christ set before him, and only him, an open door to go into all the world to preach the gospel. And brethren, he did it, and he finished the work Christ gave him to do. Now the ministry of the scattered and divided churches of God refused to hear Christ's voice. They refused the restored original truth. Why? The reason is they reject the biblical fact that they are, and I am, in the last era of the church. And that era is latest here. We are all in that era. Jesus said it was he who opened and it was he who closed the door to a work or an era. Notice Revelation 3 verse 7. And to the angel of the church of Philadelphia, write these things, says he that is holy, he that is true, and he that has the key of David, he that opens, and no man shuts, and shuts, and no man opens. I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, and no man can shut it. For you have a little strength, and have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Now that door was set before Herbert Armstrong and nobody else. And all the ministry of the worldwide Church of God at that time agreed. And those are the same ministers today. And they understood that. Now notice what Paul wrote about Christ opening a door to preach the gospel in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 9. He states, for a great door, an effectual, powerful door is opened unto me, and there are many adversaries. Yes, as there were many who opposed Paul at that time, there were many intellectuals in the worldwide Church of God who opposed the lost apostle, Herbert Armstrong. Even today, these same intellectuals, these same men, still do. Notice what Mr. Armstrong said in a sermon dated June the 24th, 1978, to a combined Pasadena congregation in the United States.
God was doing really a great work through me and through this church up to about 10 years ago, 9 or 10, right around 1969. We were one. Nobody was in doubt about who's in charge. And then many near the top began every man to try to do his own thing. He wasn't trying to do God's thing, he was trying to do his own. And the spirit of competition began to come in. At the same time, what I call the leaven of intellectualism was coming in and gripping the college, and also gripping our congregation locally here, and more or less the whole church. I've noticed that thing of intellectualism ever since the college was started. In fact, before that, especially then. I noticed it the first year of Ambassador College.
Now, Paul continued in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 12. Furthermore, when I came to Troas to preach Christ's gospel, and a door was opened unto me of the Lord. Notice, that door to preach the gospel was opened to Paul, an apostle. Now, in 1959, God opened a powerful door to Mr. Armstrong, to the work, to preach the gospel to Russia, using a powerful 400,000 watt radio station called Radio Monte Carlo. And it was beamed directly on Moscow. The gospel went out to Russia. Now let me continue with Paul in Colossians 4:3. Withal praying also for us that God would open unto us a door of utterance to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in bonds, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. The Apostle Paul traveled with assistance. However, Christ only used his voice to preach the gospel. Now the lost apostle understood that Matthew 24 verse 14 was directing him, Herbert Armstrong, to go to the world with the gospel. Notice, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. Then shall the end come. Now, before we continue, let me first read verses 4 and 5 of Matthew 24. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Now we may ask, deceive who? Deceive what? Well, deceive the church of God. He was talking to the 4 disciples privately. Notice and check Mark chapter 13 verse 3. Well, let me read Mark 13 verse 3. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew asked him privately. Jesus was telling these men, these apostles, who were the foundation of the church, you could read Ephesians 2 verse 20, not to be deceived. And today these same words apply to you, and they apply to me in this end of the age, because many have become deceived. Those 4 men sitting privately with Jesus were already ordained as apostles by Jesus Christ. Read Luke 6:13 and Matthew chapter 10. So Jesus went on to say to these apostles in Matthew 24 verses 10 to 12, And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. My dear brethren, that happened at that time. And it's happening almost exactly the same today in the scattered churches of God. Now, let me give you an example. If you were a member or were a baptized member of the Worldwide Church of God, go on a Sabbath to attend services with any of these churches, especially the Philadelphia Church of God or the Restored Church of God. You will eventually be asked to either leave or first be counseled by one of their ministers before you attend. Now, verse 11 of Matthew 24. And many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many. In this verse, the word prophet means a religious impostor. For example, there are men in the scattered churches of God who claim to be that they are that prophet, or that they are an apostle. Now, the leader of the Restored Church of God, David Pack, he thinks he's the Elijah to come. Well, regardless of the claims of these men, this does not excuse the leaders of the scattered churches of God claiming that they are doing Christ's work. Now, why do I say that? Well, verse 12. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. Iniquity is a condition without law, without the law of God. Even though these churches claim to obey the commandments of Christ, they reject the rule of Christ by rejecting the one fundamental doctrine, the greatest doctrine of all, which is the government of God. They did not hear the voice of Jesus Christ when they were taught that doctrine by Herbert Armstrong. No, they rejected it because of their agendas. So now Jesus is talking to them while he is knocking on their door. Yes, their door, a door which these leaders in all these scattered churches, independent of Christ, opened to do their own work. They are deceived into thinking it is the same door that was opened to the last apostle. It is not the door Christ opened to Philadelphia. It's not, brethren. Because if he did, if he opened that to these churches, they would be unified. They would be unified under one rulership, under Christ. And furthermore, Jesus would not be standing outside knocking and asking them to let him come in and to teach them or to sup with them. No, he closed that door to Philadelphia. When the apostle died, your salvation, brethren, let me tell you, that door closed when Mr. Armstrong died, and your salvation depends on you understanding that. Matthew 24:13. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Endure what? What must the church endure? Well, this endurance has everything to do with the completion of the gospel, the completion of the preaching of the gospel as a work. And they would not have allowed an apostasy, those that were told to endure, if they would have understood that once the apostle died, the next era of the church would begin. And the ministry would have faithfully taught the church to remain zealous and united and not to become lukewarm when the apostle died. No, the church would have rallied around the members and held them together. Now the Greek word for end in verse 13 is telos. It's the same word used in Matthew 24:14. The gospel ended once all nations were reached. And those in verse 13 were to endure, even though there was no work preaching the gospel as a worldwide work. Yes, they had to endure. Hang in there. Now, as I said, the word end in Matthew 24:14 is the same word telos. It does not mean an end of a period of time. Rather, as Thayer's Greek lexicon defines it, it is a termination, the limit at which a thing ceases to be. Always of the end of some act or state, but not the end of a period of time. And what thing ceased to be in verse 14? It was the preaching of the gospel. Once Christ decided it had reached its limit as a worldwide work, the apostle died, and that work came to an end. It ceased. The door was closed. Jesus then faces the seventh era, the lamp in Revelation 1:13, which is Laodicea, and begins to work with its messenger. However, there's an interlude between verse 14 and verse 15 of Matthew 24. Verse 15 states, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place," then in parentheses, "whoso reads, let him understand." This verse begins with when, which means at what time. When means at that time. Prior to that, there is an interlude in which the seventh era of Laodicea starts and does its work. John was responsible for canonizing the New Testament, and because he added, by that time, whosoever reads, let him understand, the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed. They were no more. The abomination which caused the desolation of the temple and Jerusalem 25 to 30 years earlier were gone. They weren't there. Christ sees an abomination in the holy place, and the only holy place on this earth today is the church of God, which is typed by the temple and by Jerusalem. Now, we will continue this message to the ministry of the scattered churches of God in our next video. So until next time, this is Michael Venish for the Vigilant Church of God, for Christ's end-time work, saying goodbye, brethren, and goodbye, friends.